Welcome to Attic Vision. I'm your host Medusa, this is my sleepy co-host Boris, and today I'm going to be talking about Squirm. If you're into this kind of thing, please hit that subscribe button and take a look at my Instagram. It's linked in the show notes below. I feature pictures of things in my collection and occasionally myself. So, Squirm. Squirm is a 1976 horror flick. This is a Vestron video, VHS. Squirm was written and directed by one of my all-time favorites, Jeff Lieberman. I've spoken about him prior in my Blue Sunshine episode. I always tell people to look him up and just watch everything. So if you are unfamiliar with him, or if you're only a smidge familiar with him, I do ask that you look him up, check him out on IMDb, go through his filmography and fill in any gaps you may have or familiarize yourself with his work, because really, to me, he's one of the all-time greats. So do that. The book, by the same name, is a novelization written directly from the screenplay, so the two are very similar because of this. Although, of course, there are differences. Some are rather obvious, some not so much. The book was published in 1978 by Sphere. It was written by Richard Curtis, who also wrote the Halloween novelization. So both, of course, take place in the same location, that being Fly Creek, Georgia. It was actually filmed in Georgia. The events take place after a big storm. Fly Creek is naturally home to a large worm population, partially due to its being so close to water, but also because there is an actual worm farm in the town. This, of course, we find out is thanks to the characters Roger and his father. So the worms are glycera, meaning they're bloodworms and they bite. All of this is natural. However, the storm takes out some power lines. These power lines fall to the ground and they have an adverse effect on the worms. By electrocuting the ground, the worms are awoken, rise to the surface, and are a bit frenzied. So they totally freak out and start eating the locals. This, of course, all happens while the local damsel, Jerry, has a beau visiting from the big city, Mick. The casting for the movie has its pros and its cons, to me. Some of the characters are just better in the book, and others fit quite nicely. Mick is played by Don Scardino. He also appeared in Cruising in 1980, as well as He Knows You're Not Alone the same year. He seems to have had a pretty good career, both on screen and behind the camera, and I really liked him in the role of Mick. He really fit the bill as a straight-laced city dude who does have to hold his own. Jerry is played by Patricia Piercy. She did have a rather short career, but she did also appear in Delusion in 1981. While she does play the role just fine, and honestly, prior to reading the book, I didn't really think anything of it, but after reading the book, I was able to view the character a bit more critically. In the novel, Jerry's character has this type of charm that I just feel like was missing in the movie. Jerry's mother is played by the late and beautiful Jean Sullivan. And what fantastic casting. Same goes for Alma, Jerry's sister. Alma is played by Fran Higgins, and this is her only credit, but I sure do love her for it. Now the movie kind of tosses you right in. There's a little bit of script at the beginning that sets up the story for the viewer, but the book sets everything up in an entirely different way. It's a much nicer opening to the story as a whole. Now the book sets up the worm farm when our character Roger is just a child. Now I do want to say that in both, Roger is an interesting character. Roger as a whole is written in the novel in such a way that the character is easy to sympathize with, at least at first. The reader feels a certain amount of sympathy for him, and he's not portrayed quite as dim as they really go for it in the movie. The character is a strange one who never really gets clearly defined as a good or a bad guy. Roger's father is experimenting with the worms He wants a more efficient, faster way to get the worms out of the ground for harvesting. The novel explains it real time to open the book. This results in Roger getting bitten. His bite is actually much more brutal in the book than it's briefly described in the movie as well. The detail that his father is experimenting on the worms and his disgust for the worms really makes more sense. It's also kind of cool to get a better, clearer insight into the experiments that his dad did do and a little bit about Roger's past. A similar childhood experiment that Jeff Lieberman experienced served as a kind of inspiration for this, actually. And just to mention it, when they are fishing later in the movie, when this story is briefly touched on and Mick gets bitten, his bite in the movie is a little bit more intense than it's described in the novel. I kind of feel like they traded this off a little bit. Okay, back to the story. After Mick has arrived in town and we have a scene where he's at a diner, he asks for an egg cream, and upon receival of the egg cream he finds there is a worm.
Out into the northbound mule. Hey! There's a worm in my egg cream, Debbie.
It is quite theatrical in the movie. It's actually a little bit more subtle in the book, and Mick just doesn't seem quite as ridiculous as he does in the movie. As the events of the film unfold, Mick and Jerry find skeletons.
What happened? Whoa. Who do you suppose it is?
Alma's let in on their secrets, and worms are wreaking total havoc. Roger's worm brain, of course, happens in both. And let me tell you, the description of this in the novel is fantastic. It is incredibly satisfying. Of course, I'm going to attribute the differences between the two to the effects that they could pull off on screen at the time. As we get closer to the end of the movie, of course there is a worm-filled finale, and that does happen in both. It is just as crazy as you would expect. During filming, they actually dropped a tree on set, for real. The part with Jerry's mom, however, is described very differently. While the basic events do happen, Mick does find her in both. In the novel, it's described super crazy. She's still half soft tissue, not a total skeleton yet. It is really gooey, really wormy, and really awesome. Once again, I'm going to attribute this to what was the most cost-effective at the time and able to be pulled off on screen. But the worms feeding on her face in the novel, crazy. The only real negative that I have to say about this book is the pacing. Now, I don't know if it's just the setting for me or if it was really the wording that was used. It is a very small novel, easy to get through, but it did take me a little bit longer than normal. I think just because of the slow pace about things. But with that said, I definitely do still recommend checking it out, especially if you really like this movie. Of course, if you haven't seen Squirm, please get out there, find a copy, watch this movie. It really is a classic horror movie with that Lieberman touch that just could not be mimicked. I love Squirm. Leave me a comment. Let me know what you think of the movie. Have you read this book? Thanks so much for tuning in. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe and check out my other videos. You've just watched Attic Vision. I'm Medusa.